When we ask them about the learning, they say the learning is enjoyable. When we ask them about assessment, they say assessment causes me stress, anxiety, uncertainty.
What exactly is formative or student-centered assessment? How do we strike a balance between formative assessments and summative assessments? How do you as a leader support this type of assessment in your school? In this episode, we talk with the Master of Assessment and Inquiry, Trevor MacKenzie. The School Leaders Project is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. We started as a passion project in a school that thought that teaching tech should be as innovative as our teaching teams, and we're now loved by more than 1,500 progressive K-12 schools all around the world. Can you explain to our audience what exactly is student-centered assessment and why is it so important?
Well, I'll give you a bit of a problem statement, a little bit of a problem scenario that I've seen over the course of this work in supporting schools implement inquiry-based learning around the world. And that is when we survey kids, and we survey a lot of kids, we survey hundreds of kids. When we survey kids about curiosity, they tell us some amazing things. And so curiosity is a byproduct of inquiry. If we're teaching from an inquiry stance and planning for inquiry, we're going to have more curious kids. And so when we survey kids, we ask them to tell us out of 10, a curiosity scale, 1 to 10, how curious are you about your learning? When they tell us an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, that means they're really curious. There are some amazing points of data that correlate to that. So when we have kids who are really curious, we see achievement increase, grades improve, kids do better in classes where they're more curious. I love that. That's great. We also see an improvement in attendance. So kids not only attend school more readily, they attend school more often. So, again, if they're interested in the learning, if they're curious about what they're learning about, they're going to come to class. The third piece is when we survey kids and we ask them questions about inquiry, questions about their learning, they tell us the darndest things, Cindy. They tell us, when I'm curious, I enjoy school. School is a place of belonging. School is a place of safety, of trust. I trust my teachers. I trust my peers. I love all of those things. Simultaneously, when we question them about assessment, they tell us a completely different scenario and completely different feelings. When we ask them about the learning, they say the learning is enjoyable. When we ask them about assessment, they say things like assessment causes me stress. Assessment causes me anxiety. Assessment causes me uncertainty. This was fascinating data. When I started to see this data roll out over the course of a number of years, I took the exact same survey and I brought it to my students in my classroom. And I asked them the exact same questions. And I was curious, would they say the same things around assessment and inquiry that other students were saying at other schools around the world? And they, in fact, said different things. They said, assessment informs my learning. Their words, not mine. They said, assessment guides my next steps. One question we ask students is assessment a teacher job, a student job, or an us job? And the students on the survey at these schools around the world would say that that's a teacher's job, where my students would say that's an us job. And I thought, well, this is telling.
So this shift from assessment is something I do to you versus assessment is something that we do together and there's purpose and intention behind it. And that purpose is your curiosity and taking it further. So how do you balance having those assessments, but also valuing kind of the entire process?
Yeah, well, those assessments, I don't undervalue those. I don't not do them with my scholars. They're very important. That data is critical. Those data points, any data that we can collect from a large body of students where we can make some assumptions, we can analyze them, we can compare them across a large data set, that's important. But the other set of data holds great importance as well. The color, the qualitative, the conferencing, the evidencing, the feedback. And so what we propose in schools that are engaged in inquiry is striking a more powerful balance between our summatives and our formatives, between those really, really high stakes standardized tests and our rich formative feedback, coaching, and conferencing. Undeniably, we don't want to get our kids ready for standardized tests by giving them more standardized tests. And that can be really hard for some teachers to hear. We want them to engage in more test prep and practice tests to get them ready for the high stakes tests. The opposite is actually true. We want to take them to performances less often and get them into coaching mode more often. We want to provide opportunity for reflection, assessment capable opportunities where they're understanding where they're at, where they need to go and what steps they need to take to get there, undeniably our students are going to do better on those standardized assessments. I have to be honest, like the balance I poke teachers to get to is kind of a 90-10 balance. 90% informative, 10% in summative. And sometimes teachers think, how is that possible? Well, I asked schools and school leaders, how many times are teachers mandated to do a standardized assessment? How many times across their assessment calendar do they have to do an assessment like that?
What are the musts?
And what are the musts? And to be honest, if we know the feedback, the conferencing, the formative is richer to guide next steps, then let's live there more often than the standardized pieces. So the 90-10 split, I know it's not a split, it's a ratio, is really, well, what are the non-negotiables? And let's do those and those alone. So numbers aren't guiding learning. The formative, the conversations, the qualitative is guiding the learning. Does that make sense, Cindy?
Totally. And I think some of the language I'd like to call out there that leaders could use with tricky families is the idea of it's a data set. And this is a relevant piece of data, but it is just one piece in this entire collection that we've curated.
Absolutely. And looking at some of the research around what those data sets do to guide student learning, does a number guide student learning, or does the formative and the qualitative guide student learning? So if we are about improving those data sets, improving those numbers, then we have to live in more opportunity for coaching, reflection, and guiding next steps, which again, that's that 90% space, and 10% is that quantitative space.
I think that would be a lovely process for every administrator listening to go through. I think sometimes we stack things without thinking of it. Oh, for reading, we're doing F&P testing. And for this, we're doing this testing. Make a calendar out exactly when all of the assessments are. And what is this communicating to families? What is this communicating to students about what we believe about assessment? And does that mirror our assessment philosophy that we have written down? Like, oof, that's some powerful stuff.
It's not easy work, Cindy, is it? It's not easy work to I referenced earlier calling a colleague into an assessment conference to help me with my blind spots. This is a very similar feeling for leaders to consider. Let's look at our assessment calendar and what is it communicating to those people that are looking at it. Another really clear indication for me is I want to look at a school's Instagram account and I want to see what it communicates about the values of the school. If it's about the most recent scholarship or the most recent award or the most recent student application that got accepted to a big university, then that's communicating to parents that that's what we're about at this school. But if it's communicating a richer experience, a student-led experience, where every so often those experiences get them a scholarship or take them to a prestigious university, that's a very different communication of values than the awards, the scholarships, the Ivy League. And I've seen schools around the world that those are the two stories, right? And what story do we want to write as a leader? We want to write the leader of the student experience and how student-centered it truly is, and not just having it be a vision statement above the entryway to a school building, isn't it?
All right, so our audience is mostly leaders. So I'm curious, what do you think that every leader should know, understand, and do in terms of student-centered assessment?
Well, I'd love for leaders to talk about extinct assessment practices, like really clearly talk to a staff, their faculty about what we don't do anymore. And I love that language. It's really liberating for a teacher to hear that from a leader. We don't assess that way anymore. There are certain things that we maybe did 5 years ago or 20 years ago, and now we know best practice. We know the research tells us that those things don't guide learning and don't propel students in terms of growth. So some things I hear leaders say, that some things I nudge leaders to say, for example, is we don't take the average of marks anymore. We don't take the average of numbers anymore, and we don't plunk them into a system and out comes an average. An average does not tell a representation of a student's learning across time. In fact, the most recent data point could take precedence over all those other data points across a span of time. And I know for some teachers, they hear that, oh, thank goodness, that's so liberating. Then we look at our grade book. How do we manage a grade book that honors the most recent data set compared to all the previous attempts for learning? Gosh, we rely on our professional judgment, don't we? Our professional responsibility and expertise. I want leaders to say that in front of staff as well. Like, I trust your professional assessment expertise. I trust that you're going to make the decisions that are going to inform students and guardians of where students are at and what their next steps are. So that would be something that I would say is an extinct assessment practice, is averaging out learning across time and honoring the most recent learning, the most recent data set as representative of where our students are at now. Another piece is living in the formative and not living in the summative. I referenced this a little bit earlier, Cindy, but anytime, the research tells us, anytime we put a number on evidence of learning and we attach feedback to that number and that evidence of learning, students will not look at the feedback. They'll only look at the number. This should be a non-negotiable in schools. If you're giving feedback, it is detached of a number. Numbers and feedback cannot coexist. They have to be separated. Teachers undeniably want to gather numbers because it fits beautifully in the grade book. It fits beautifully in the spreadsheet. It's the feedback that will drive the learning, and it's the feedback that will propel the learning. The number will shut down the learning. I want to hear leaders say that aloud to teachers. You don't have to gather numbers all day long. Instead, live in formative, live in feedback more often, and detach the two, the feedback from the number. These assessment truths, these are best practices. Many teachers, they won't do them unless they hear a leader speak to them and say, this is the space that we're in now. That Safety. Way of doing it, we don't do anymore. Now we engage in these practices that we know are good for kids, that we know are good for propelling learning moving forward. It allows us to be unbiased, patient, specific, and kind in the feedback that we give. So that's something that I encourage all leaders to consider, is how do you create the conditions for teachers to connect, to collaborate, to work together with regards to assessment, and then they make decisions around some of those tensions in assessment to best meet the students' needs. Does that make sense, Cindy?
It does. I'm hearing a theme of, within your classroom or in the leadership level, taking almost an empathetic design approach, that we're saying, hey, these are problems. We're not assuming anyone is bad or wrong in this. Let's figure this out together. And I think if we can all adopt that attitude of curiosity over assumption, that alone can be so transformative in our schools.
Absolutely. Trust the professional integrity of your staff to come together when they're given time to make the best decisions possible for their scholars. And of course, if the value is centering the student, whether it's inquiry or assessment, then of course that value is going to be demonstrated in the time that's provided for staff to connect and collaborate around those tensions or those values. Absolutely. You said empathetic. I love that word. I couldn't agree more.